And I have the pleasure to engage Bob Kandetu, who served as the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Information and Communication Technology during the period when Dr. Hage G was the Prime Minister. In fact, he was part of the first cohort of Permanent Secretaries right after independence. A very good morning to you, and thank you so much for making time out to join us.
Good morning, sir.
I actually just failed to mention also former Director General of the NBC, but I think as we unpack the conversation, we'll get to that.
You must tell them the one they fired. You must also say the one they fired.
The one they fired. Okay, now we'll leave the politics out of this one for now. Nonetheless, just starting off and looking at, of course, in terms of how the news reached you, where and how did the news of the late president passing find you? And what were some of your initial reactions to that news?
Yeah, I was in Kandetu. It has been, having worked with news, you get conversant with how to follow a story. And the way the story evolved became suspect in itself. And so I closely followed it. But I knew I have to wait until the information is formally, shared. It was painful, of course. When something like that hits you, you go back onto memory lane, and that's when it becomes even more painful. It was very painful. How did I react? I went back and I thought about him, not only as politician, as leader, but also as a human being, because I had some time to interact with him at various levels.
Let's take it back a bit to look at some of your initial encounters with Hage Geingob, the man, even before you started working with him. What was the first? How did you meet the first time? What were your first encounters?
You know, the curtain on my mind opens meeting him in New York. I was a student then. He was the director of the Institute for Namibia in Lusaka, Zambia. We got together. That was the first time I ever met him. We did some work together at the SWAP office at the United Nations during the time.
That was in New York?
In New York then, okay. In the 80s. Then we had lunch, the broad group now. The one thing that took me by surprise is he followed Namibian football at the time inside Namibia.
Wait, hold on. This is in the 80s?
In the 80s, yes.
And he was following Namibian football
inside the country, remembering regular top-flight players, the kind of Oscar Mengo, Higwepi Kawea, Lemmy Gnarip, and he literally mentioned them by name. But then he felt very bad about the fact that they did away with his team, Etosha Lions from Tsume, for which he used to play. And he said, he was so serious that he felt that when he came back, he was going to either reactivate the team or start a new team called Etosha Lions. So that's really our first interaction. And subsequent to that, I then formally met him when he returned leading the Namibian advanced team, the SWAPO advanced team for the masterminding of the election campaign for the United Nations Security Council Resolution 435. So that's when he came, that's when he returned, that's when we then clicked for real.
But in terms of the return, I understand, of course, it was also quite much of a fanfare. There is this famous picture that we see of him when he comes off the plane, kissing the tarmac, of course, welcoming back to Namibia. The reason why I'm bringing this up is, I mean, we know he's been in exile for a decade plus at that stage. And you're mentioning now that even while in exile, the man was following the local football leagues, knew who the main players were, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that tells you really about the love that he had for his country. Reflect a little bit on how poignant that return was and the value that carries.
Yeah, Comrade Hage is by nature a very versatile and complex person. He was part of all various aspects of life, elements of life in Namibia. He was a sportsman, he was a politician, he was a believer, a churchgoer. He was just about many things. He was a good dancer, as a matter of fact. You meet him on the dance floor, you see, your partner will walk over to him, you know. So he was almost, yeah, it was not just fanfare, the return. It was good, it was really nostalgia. They came and all of them followed his example, you know. Then it was very involved. That is the time when there was the element of the Lubango Hate. Those of us who were running around with SWAPO campaigning, we would go to meetings at places like Dolam, and at the end of the meeting, one young lady would stand up in the back and say, Fertelos Biki Fandilu Bango Khati. So it was not easy, and those were the elements that he had to deal with because his role was to, as it were, make sure that the people of Namibia from all aspects of life get to appreciate the fact that SWAPO was not just a killer organization that it was, but a liberation movement that came to be characterized with problems that they were trying to grow out of.
But we know, of course, there was also, if you look at it, particularly if you talk about Geingob, the administrator, we can't leave this on alone. We know that a lot of those that were in government during the time were trained in exile. So we know there were some tensions between the returnees versus those that were, of course, working for the struggle internally. How did he handle that strife?
These were subtle tensions. Really deeply rooted in the propensity to want to garner for positions. Those who were in the country felt that we must also occupy senior positions. Yeah. In fact, as it was at the time, he managed, and I want to focus on how he managed it. He managed by broadly consulting, very closely advising President Nyoma regularly about what he picks up, talking to different people, but also masterminding programs that will make sure that it pulls everybody together. In fact, I served on what was called the Presidential Manpower Committee. That is the committee that was advising the president, meaning that was there to put together a team that would be permanent secretary, director for this, also, but also who
sort of the appointment of the executive level of the public service.
Yeah, of the public service, but also advising on the real members of the executive, who must be minister, must be deputy minister. And at that point, we were already tried to bring in people who were not necessarily members of SWAPO.
Oh, so it wasn't like arbitrary or the president decides by himself. There was a whole committee set up to assist in terms of
and that was as a result of Hage's approach to trying to pull things together. In fact, at the time, we started off with ministers who were not members of SWAPO and deputy ministers like Advocate Rukoro, late, and Hage G. And in fact, from the beginning, I must say that he wanted in his approach, and he advised and he requested that we accommodate the DTA, which was upstaging themselves to be the main opposition. There was a guy called I forget his name. He was on the leadership of the DTA. We earmarked him to be Minister of Finance, but of course the DTA refused and said that no, we don't want that. It was his ideas. They wanted to be, of course, they wanted to.
So this appointment, if you look at right now, of course, a lot of people were saying, if you look at it in retrospect now, the appointment of Esther Munyangwe saying, no, but how can you? So it's not a new approach of involving the opposition at the highest level in as far as administration of the country is concerned.
It is not a new approach. For example, in the first government, people like I said, Advocate Rukoro became Deputy Minister of Justice, Hage G, Deputy Minister of Youth and Sport, a number of them. Gert Hanekom became the Minister of Agriculture. In fact, Gert Hanekom was not even a member of any political party at the time. I'm trying to remember the guy I said from the DTA. But then at the time, the DTA said, we don't know. So the approach was, we can only work if we manage it. You see? And you must also understand it from the backdrop of how the Constitution evolved. Whereas everybody in the country, especially the South African-related political parties, we call them the internal accords groups, they were determined to make sure that SWAPO does not govern because it was supposed to be a
rebel movement.
Not just that, a communist organization. When SWAPO arrived, SWAPO put on the table a constitutional proposals that everybody took in this Constituent Assembly. And it was the DT, I think it was Dirk Mach, if I recall well,
yes,
who came and said, we must accept this document as the standard document.
The standard draft, around that one.
Yeah, and really that's what happened. That's what started to cave down the tensions and all these kinds of things. And Hage stayed at it in terms of trying to make sure that everybody get to appreciate that this is not all going to be a SWAPO government, it's going to be all of us government with everybody playing their role.
So it had to be, in terms of strong consideration, and that's also one of the things that many had mentioned, that whenever he has an eye for identifying talent, you must also have the technical aptitude to be able to do the job.
And he had the propensity to be trusted and not suspected when he says, I want you to do this. Even the members of the opposition then as politicians, but anybody else, he engaged along the spectrum, the line of business. they appreciate the fact that, look, I'm talking to Hage now, notwithstanding the fact that he's a member of SWAPO, a leader in SWAPO. So that went a very long way in pulling our nation together.
In terms of pulling the nation together, I think one of the things, and it comes together at the Constituent Assembly as well, one of the major compromises that some feel was a compromise was Article 144, where they're saying that, look, the public service that was there then will remain intact. Whoever the new cadres are that join. So in many cases, we see that, particularly even at PS level, you had to take over a public service that was already dominated by the previously advantaged, and of course those tensions between the two. Reflect on the importance of that compromise, for lack of a better word, and why it was an important one.
There was not just a compromise. That was a constitutional provision that was intended. And the basic principle of it was no law shall be repealed without it being replaced with a properly thought law. If you say there shall not be death sentence, you must replace it with a very properly argued rationale. If you say we are taking away this Bantu education, you must be saying what are we putting instead.
In the place of this Bantu education.
So it was not just a question of we are playing. We made some mistakes, of course. One of these mistakes we made was around education, but that's maybe a discussion for another day. But I'm saying that it was not a compromise as if it's to appease anybody. It was just to say we need to make sure, for example, at the time when we talk about the police force, we didn't have anybody with an experience in the police force. When you talk about the army, we had to bring in people from the ranks of Kufut, for example. Some of them, I'm stopping short of mentioning names, some of them who were, responsible for killing our people, visibly, physically. So, but we said now we must look not in terms of who's right, who's wrong, who was right, who was wrong, but what is the right thing to do now if we are to take this country forward. And we won in more ways than one.
But how was it like for you, though, as administrator? Because as the permanent secretary now, you are the chief accounting officer for the ministry. It's immediately after independence. And more than that, you are running the institution that's previously responsible for state propaganda, for lack of a better word now. It's the Ministry of Information and Communication. Reflect on that a little bit for us.
Yeah, that was a challenge. The first one was how to reorganize the Namibia, at the time, the Southwest Africa Broadcasting Corporation. I assisted the minister called Hidipo Hamtenya, who was charged with the business of reorganizing that law. We ran into a roadblock. The people who were here were very, very strongly against anything that we wanted to do. And they wrote us saying if we want to change anything, it was rough. So, but then they went through their own advice. I spoke to some of the people who I knew. There was a guy called Fesser in the whole intelligence the broadcasting network. And I said, Fesser, you brought me to bring the Bruce there. So, when I said, just to say that we are not going to take chances. We are not going to waste our time by the standoff with people whom we know what they were doing yesterday. So the next morning they came to the office and they were apologetic, and that's where we started. We started off by, again, in conformity with the legal provisions, what must be replaced, it must be replaced with a well-thought idea. And that's how we really started doing it. And I must tell you that I cut my teeth in the civil service of Namibia at the feet of Comrade Geingob. And I, in a way, understudied him at a distance. I didn't work in his office directly, as you well know. He had the capacity to organize his office and to be disciplined. If he tells you, we shall start the meeting at 10 o'clock, 10 to 10 at the latest, he is there. When you arrive, he's ready to start the meeting. He does not arrive at 2 minutes past 10. And you keep monitoring him there, and you realize that this is the person. He was a good administrator indeed. He was a good manager. He was a good communicator. He was a good interactor. He was endowed with love, the kind of love that you love to the extent that it hurts. Of course, he was a difficult person. When you differ with him and he doesn't like what you're doing, he could be vengeful also, you know. But that's some of the characteristics, the complex characteristics of a person like him. He was a blessing to the state of Namibia from that time, and had it not be the case that was there, chances are in some ways we would still be singing We Shall Overcome.
Seriously. In terms of, many say that also that he had this, in terms of the commitment, if he's committed to a certain vision or something that you need to enact, he will stand by that commitment. Like, for example, with the Constituent Assembly, when there used to be arguments and misunderstanding about certain stuff, he would apparently adjourn the meeting and say, look, let's reflect on it and have some side conversations, try to lobby on the side as well, until everybody buys into the idea.
There were a number of challenges. One challenge was the question of the death penalty. I think many people who were in the internal Accords political complexion felt that if there was a death penalty, all of them will go to the Hage.
Yeah.
And our colleagues, some of them were trying to dig in, but he said, look, this must, even if it's to come back this time around, we must understand the theoretical underpinnings of these people. That was one. Another one was the president, the election of the president. We as SWAPO had come ready for Nyoma to lead, but to be an executive president who is elected directly by the population through universal suffrage. Others felt that the president must be elected by parliament. So there was a bit of thing there, but he avoided, as chairman of the Constituent Assembly, he avoided, unbridled, broad lens kind of discussions. He would, and then, as you're correctly pointing out, then he'd say, okay, let's have a break. That was true. But towards the end of the Constitution, the constitutional development, there was a situation that was almost bad. What happened is that Captain Diergaard of the Basters, he had a political party, and at that point he was advised to secede and break away and become part of South Africa, and then they were going to create a corridor that leads from Rehoboth to Walvis Bay. You remember that Walvis Bay at the time was still,
a South African hands.
So it almost became bad. But again, because of these interactions, we had interactions with some of the people in the intelligence, and they gave us advanced information, and I kept running into him and to Minister Mtinya to say, look, this is what this one we must dig in. He said, yeah, we must dig in, but we must not, I'll please the president, we must not declare war on these people. Let me go and negotiate. He went to Rehoboth.
Seriously?
Yes. He went to
Rehoboth
to meet with Diergaard. And he had by then collected the little Afrikaans that he could remember. It was when he got there and Diergaard said, what are we offering you? Rooibos tea drink? To say, yeah, 100 rooibos tea drink. And it worked. I won't go into the whole story, but it worked. Diergaard bought in. He became part of this the Constitution came to be adopted with acclamation, with no abstention. So I'm saying, at face value, it was like getting into meeting, getting out of it. Like you're correctly pointing out, when these meetings were left, he would be up until 3 o'clock. But because he was such a disciplined person, there was no time when he would go back to the meeting without having gone to brief the president of SWAPO. The president was not part of the constitutional development. He at the time lived in Kandetu.
But he was being updated as these things
every day at the end of the day when the constitution was broken, he would go to brief the president, and then every morning before it starts, he would go back to the president to see to gauge the extent to which the president reflected and what he has in mind. So he was such a versatile player.
One of the things that Timothy Schneider wrote in a book called On Tyranny, he speaks about how democratic governments tend to become dictatorships, tyrannical. And he says that the country starts to erode the moment we lose professional ethics, the moment civil society, not civil society, but civil servants start losing professional ethics, police officers, judges, etc., etc. Talk to me about his approach to and the importance of having a professional civil service, and some of those codes of ethics, etc., that were put in place during his tenure as Prime Minister.
He was indeed very much strong on that, on the fact that we must perform. This state must perform.
Okay.
We were challenged by the fact that we had people we found, and we had to keep them until they can be retired formally. That those we found, we decided we're not going to run a haphazard government, and it came from him. Those who are in and we want them out, they must be retired formally through a process that makes them retiree, not being pushed in the wilderness. We must bring in people of our own, meaning those who were locked out up to this point. That is where affirmative action came in. But then we had some challenges. the people we were bringing in, some of them were not as skillful as we have wanted to do, and that became the challenge. We would identify somebody to do a job, and it would be a mixture of political there's this and the other thing. And that is where we did not do too good a job to make sure that at the start, everyone we brought in to head departments to do this and the other thing, even at ministerial levels, where people of quality who can take the process forward. And that's where the compromise came in, and that we paid a lot with regard to. And there's some of the problems that we have in government are as a result of that problem.
And I want us to reflect on that a little bit later on when we come back after this visit to the marketplace, particularly the size of the public service as it sits now. What were some of the contributing factors? And I think just the overall vision in terms of improving that going forward. Well, if you just join us, we're still watching a special tribute, of course, to Dr. Hage G, Geingob, the statesman, the late statesman, as we are celebrating his role, of course, in setting up the administration, the public service of the Republic of Namibia. We're speaking to the former permanent secretary, in fact, the first permanent secretary of information and communication of an independent Namibia, Bob Kandetu. But for now, we quickly go for a short visit to the marketplace and break for the news highlights at 11 o'clock. Renil Deusik, who's standing by. When we come back, we conclude the conversation with him. Stay with us. Welcome back. We continue, of course, with that special broadcast and tribute to the late Dr. Hage G, Geingob. Rinalda Ayusiku bringing us the news at 11 o'clock. Thank you very much for that. Don't forget to catch the full news bulletin at 1 o'clock this afternoon. If you've missed the headlines, you can always follow them on our digital news platforms. Just search for NBC Digital News, particularly on your YouTube platforms. We continue to reflect on Hage Geingob, the administrator, for today's edition of the tribute, the 17th day of tributes since the passing of the late president. And I'm joined by the first permanent secretary of the independent Namibia's Ministry of Information and Communication, Bob Kandetu, to reflect on his role as an administrator and the effect and influence he had on the public service. Mr. Kandetu, when we went for the break, of course, we had just started reflecting on the public service, the professionalism that wanted to be instilled in the public service. But one of the challenges that we set with right now, and I think over the last 10, 15 years we've been talking about, was the rate at which the public service was growing. Some felt, and there were criticism already back in the day, that there was a lot of people that were brought in the service to provide jobs for comrades, etc. For example, like the position of undersecretary was always scrutinized. Reflect on that a little bit for us.
As I said at the beginning, we were very much concerned about the need to sustain the balancing act, to make sure that in conformity with the understandings that led to the independence of Namibia, we keep the people that we found there, who were, as a matter of fact, Namibians, many of them were, even though they were appointed by the previous dispensation, to inherit everything that was there, to keep all of them, and to retire people not as a rule of thumb, but to retire them procedurally. And that in itself required rules and regulations that would have to be enacted in law. And that is really what became the challenge. We found people, we had to keep them. We had to retire them procedurally, but then we had people we had to bring in. I think we made a mistake at two levels. Okay. One level is the people we had to retire, some of them we took too long to retire because we did not want to retire them arbitrarily. We were emotional at the time, and some people would say, but you see, these were Namibians who deserved the same treatment. And it took some time. The other level is people who were coming from outside, meaning from outside the civil service, not just from outside the country.
Yeah, but the outside the civil service was already established.
Had to be accommodated. They themselves put us under tremendous pressure because they said, look here, you are taking too long, you are committing these boas, you don't want to move, and all that and all that. But that was as a result of the fact that in Hage's book, everything that had to be done not only procedurally, but also in conformity with the capacity to take the country forward through performance. And that became a challenge. You would have somebody being appointed as a chief clerk who is just coming from the war, who all his life for the last 20 years was carrying a gun. Now, the mistake that we made was not only to appoint these people, but to not orient them towards the task at hand. And this as we speak now, this is my tremendous, this is my interest now to see to it that from now on as we go forward, 3 things we have to obtain concurrently. One is to make sure that the people we appoint in positions are appointed in positions that are written down that has qualification criteria, so that you don't just take a person and put him in a position. And secondly, that these people have the skills that match that. Should we have somebody who is already in a job that we think is overqualified for the person, this person must go through a process of skills auditing and be upgraded if we think that is the case. And if he's advanced in age and we think there's need for that, to be retired procedurally. These became our challenges at the time, and I think these challenges still haunt us to a large extent.
If one looks at the issue around accountability and transparency, we see the president was, particularly when he took over as the head of state, very keen around the principles of transparency and accountability, to the point where he made an example and declared his personal assets. Reflect on that. Was that the case also during the time when he was prime minister, or those new maxims that are being carried out now?
You see, Comrade Hage's stance, propensity to declare his assets were not new. He had at some point organized a conference, I don't remember the year, while he was prime minister, a conference where he was talking about integrity. That was to debate integrity. And that is already then when he mooted the idea of having to declare assets, to make sure that there is transparency. You cannot have a transparent government unless you have people who are running the government being transparent. And that was his point of departure. It was a bit difficult. Many comrades of him at the executive did not like the idea. And I'm stopping short of mentioning names. And that frustrated him greatly. In the end, he had to...
But feel free to mention names.
No, I won't. No, it's difficult these days. But I'm saying that it became a problem because it was like you are trying to... And I know people at the time started calling him an imperialist agent who was reading the New York Times. It was an unfortunate experience then for him. But yes, as a result of that, at the level of the senior people, the executive, he ran into some roadblocks. But then he started operating at the level of operationalizing that at the level of the civil service. It became also problematic in the sense that when he got in, he became frustrated, in my view. He became frustrated by the level of the capacity of many of the people in the executive.
And I think he had to deal with, obviously the leader of the government.
And this is how he had to come up with this cabinet within a cabinet, this group of advisors, of top-notch advisors, legal experts and economic experts. That's where people like Monica Kamui and Penny came in and all that. Because he wanted to make sure that things are done at a different level. But then, unfortunately, you cannot have a cadre of that nature while you have your ministers. How does a minister of economics...
Yes. And the other question also is, what I also experienced, even personally, having spent a little bit of time also in administration and central government, was that separation now. Of course, as the permanent secretary, you are responsible, you are the accounting officer at administrative level. And then you have the minister that comes in as a political office bearer. Now, many a times, when it comes to now the management of the institution, there can be sometimes conflict between the ED or the permanent secretary and the minister. How was it like during the time, though? Were ministers able to stay away from the day-to-day operations?
It was not possible. It was not always possible, because the ministers felt that they must be in charge of the total exercise of running the ministry, and that they had to dictate to the permanent secretary, to the civil service,
on operational
to the
matters
accounting,
also.
yeah, on operational matters. Some understood and stayed away until we had to compare notes. Some felt that I must tell you to give this card to this one, you must do it. When you say, but there's no budget for that, they'll say, okay, the minister said. Well, as permanent secretary, we had the right to refuse, to decline an instruction. We thought this, but it was always difficult, and it was always. But all I'm belaboring, as you can see now, is that unfortunately, let me give you an example. The Ministry of Labour at some point had 3 people: one deputy minister, one permanent secretary, and one chief clerk. The deputy minister was transferred to the Ministry of Works, Transport and Communication as deputy minister. Then the permanent secretary, listen very carefully, the permanent secretary of the same ministry was transferred to the Ministry of Works, Transport and Communication. Then the chief clerk was appointed Minister of Works and Transport.
Oh.
Close your eyes and tell me, was that based on certain criterions? What was it?
I'm a bit confused because you're not mentioning names. I think the names could have potentially helped. But I see what you're saying in terms of that move for him coming now and becoming the political head of the organization while he was reporting to these people previously.
When the political head comes there, it's either to chief clerk who reported to these bloody people.
Yeah.
Now, chances are there for him to show them that he's in charge.
That I'm in charge now. I'm the boss now.
You know? And so those are some of the challenges that we had to deal with. The appointments of senior government persons such as ministers were not always pegged on the propensity, the capacity, the expectation to perform. It was an accommodation, a political accommodation. It's okay if you want to pay off or to accommodate somebody politically because of whatever, as a president of as a prime minister or whatever, but then help this person to
understand their role.
Yeah,
and to
understand their role, but have the capacity to perform. Because if they are not performing, they are not helping the state to progress. And these are some of the challenges that we had, and I think we continue to have them now.
And one of the things I really wanted to mention, particularly with regards to that, is could that be the reason why even in the public, before you work in the service, you have this thinking that the buck stops with the minister, where the buck actually stops with the ED. For example, I mean, a primary example, if one of the other facilities is not maintained, people say, yeah, but what is the minister doing? Well, the ED is the one that's responsible for the budget and getting the actual work done. Could that be, some of the challenges that we're sitting with, and how do we address that thinking with the public, perhaps to see how we also improve accountability within the public service?
We can do that, and the final responsibility, the challenge, if you will, lies with the ED. The ED is the person who must play the staccato between the office of the president, office of the minister, and his office downwards, to make sure that where his office stops, the office of the president's personnel starts. But all of these are under her in terms of control for budget spending and this and the other thing, preference, but also for guidance. Yeah. Now, if you have the ED, the person at the level of the ED, which you used to call permanent secretaries then, if you have a person at that level who does not understand their role very carefully, not only that, but who may not have the capacity to manage things at that level. And let's be honest, people who are appointed to positions of ED are not always having the capacity to perform there. And when they are appointed, we do not try to prod the extent to which they can perform and help them grow through skilling, that's what I call in-service training. But we let them sink or swim.
Well, one of the things before I let you go, I think just to tap into that historical context as well, many times we see that particularly with regards to the political office bearers, we know that they're always on their feet. They're always at the risk of losing their jobs. And one of the reasons why the permanent secretary was changed to the executive director was that to change the thinking from you permanently have that job. But many are saying we need to go a step further and say that there must be a tenure for executive directors, that the power might be a little bit too concentrated, the fact that we can't get rid of them as quickly as we can, political office bearers. So if something is wrong at the ministry, reshuffle of the cabinet, you see, but still the same ED, still the same directors.
Yeah, the flexibility, the assignment as it is was intended to provide the flexibility to to shift and shuffle, if you will, to get rid of some of those who are
But
not
do we have the
performing.
flexibility? The
But
labor
no,
law
that's
is
what
so
I'm
tight.
leading to. That's what I'm leading to. The unfortunate thing is that all this was left open in the sense that it was to the discretion of the appointing officer. It was not contractual, and I think that's what you're trying to say. Let's have the ED have a job, their job, not at the discretion of the head of state or whoever appoints, but it must be contractual. 5 years later, you must know that you must go. In fact, you must also have the will to go if you want to. And the same must be with ministers.
Term limits?
Term limits, yes. 5 years or whatever years. But you must know that I must work towards leaving a legacy at a time when I am to leave. Yeah, subject to reappointment if you want to or if it is provided for. That way, then nobody is under pressure to retain you or to let you go because they think you are not performing, or you don't agree because you gave them the wrong car, or small things like that. So I think you are right. In terms of term limits is very important. Even ministers, you must be able to say the contract of the minister is for 5 years, and it's a contract. Subject to renewal should the appointing officer feel that it is necessary, or subject to termination.
Rather meeting performance targets than the appointing authority. Talking about that performance as well, we see that he tried to bring that culture in, President Geingob, by providing, of course, for the first time, performance agreements to ministers. We're not really privy to the details of that performance agreements, but many have hailed it and said that that's a step towards improving accountability. Reflect on that a bit.
It is a step in the right direction. The problem is that sometimes you appoint a person who cannot, say for example, I'm just giving an example. You take somebody who is hailing from a classroom who was a teacher and you make them Minister of Finance. I must give an example because this one is my friend. I don't think he'll bash me. The President Bumba, he came back, he is he's a teacher. And he was thrown from every department. He came in, he was my boss when I was permanent secretary. He moved on to be a chief negotiator when we were reintegrating welfare by. He then came back and did something, I think Minister of Agriculture. He was Minister of Agriculture. Then he was Minister of Finance for 7 years, the longest serving Minister of Finance. The question is, when he did that, was that on the basis of knowing that he can perform? One. Two, when we knew that he cannot perform, did we try to upgrade his skillfulness, or did he have to sink or swim? These are some of the challenges that we had then. We continue to have them, and we may have unless we think very critically.
So even though we bring in performance agreements, you're saying that performance agreements or the expectation for that performance must also come with the necessary support from a capacity perspective for us.
If you appoint Vedra Kandetu, who is just a social worker by training, and you appoint him Minister of Agriculture, you must be able to prod the extent to which this person can perform. And if you think he cannot perform or he may have challenges, try to skill him. Otherwise you fail.
Otherwise you fail. In terms of the legacy of Dr. Hage Geingob, in fact, before I get to his legacy, we know that you're also an avid writer, and you had written the biography of the late Hosea Kutako. Is Bob Kandetu going to lead the procession for the Hage Geingob book, or will he be part of that conversation?
No, there is a family business, maybe a state business. I have the right to write. In fact, I was just sharing with you. I wrote a thing that is publishing, that I'm publishing. I threw it out on social media. The title is Comrade Hage Geingob signed off. A personal This is a personal reflection. I'm sharing it on social media now, and I spoke to one of the newspapers. They might publish it just for free. So I feel that at some point I may want to write, or to extend what I just said, the point of departure, Comrade Hage Geingob left, an incomplete legacy, and have a personal reflection, write a book. Yes, I'm eager to do a number of these, but I don't want to take officially a book like that, because it will be, once the late Comrade Garweb, Moses Garweb, called me and he wanted me to do his biography. I said, fine, we agreed. And I said, your biography will have to be Swapo's biography. Are you ready for that one? And he said, what do you mean? I said, okay, the Lubango Khati you have to address openly, the what you have to address. And he said, okay, I'll come back to you to that one. Then the same, my friend Thioben Gurira wanted to do. And when I mentioned these things, he started saying, I don't want to speak about other people. I say, you say, but you are part of this other people.
But what is that bringing us to now? Of course, you see, the president passed. and there's not a detailed account, even though he had so much to do with putting this nation together as we know, the nation state as we know it. And then many others, of course, are already in the departure lounge, for the lack of a better word. But we don't see the literature.
Namibians by nature don't write, and they don't write because they don't read. They don't read because they don't write. That's a challenge. Two, people are careful, as I'm saying. You see, the one thing that made SWAPO succeed is because all leadership in SWAPO were very conscious. They did not want to write about their life in SWAPO because they did not want to be seen to, at some point, to have him presided over the demise of SWAPO.
Yeah, but it was war. I mean, we know it wasn't all rainbows and sunshine.
So those
there
are
were
the
good
challenges.
and the bad.
Many relevant stories we are not going to hear about, I must tell you now, because people are very reluctant. You run into a friend who was in the army, you run into a friend who was there with this, you tell comrade, let's do your thing. You can dictate and I can write them down. They go on the first, when you transform, you say, okay, this is not explained. You say, I don't want to talk about that, you see, because I don't know how the other comrades will feel about it. You see, this is our challenge.
So we need to just accept that. I think as generations that will be torchbearers in the future, that we have an incomplete history recorded, and that it will pass on with the likes of Bob Kandetu.
And my final
others.
statement on that is somewhat of a challenge that I'm prepared to help anybody, craft their biographies or their autobiographies or whatever they want to write. And I'm saying this because I know people are going to be reluctant to do that. Whoever wants to do something, I'm prepared to be their foot soldier.
In terms of the legacy of the president, as you're concluding, what kind of legacy does he leave for state administration in Namibia?
He will leave a legacy of having been party in leading a process that knocked together an experience called Namibia. An experience called Namibia in all its facets, in terms of the politics, civil service, society, cultural configuration, sports, church appreciation, all these things. Hage was there. In fact, I was party to leading sports. I ran a club called Black Africa, which was the mainstay of Namibia's football for about 8 years.
One of the greatest football club in the country.
It was. If you know where it is now, you won't say where it is.
I know where it is now, but it's like, I mean, it still doesn't take away from the fact that it's the greatest.
Historically, yes.
It's a bit of a dip now. So I think
and you are right. You see, having said what you just said, we must not look at pitfalls, shortcomings, and try to define a person's life around that. This is where I start off by saying, had it not been for the person Hage Geingob there, Bedirur van Sake, pulling together things, running a SWAPO campaign, a SWAPO election directorate at the time when it was very difficult to make sense as a SWAPO leader in this country, pulling things together to the extent that people from the opposite parties would say, Hage is my friend, in fact we were there together. Had we not have had somebody like that who in fact rugby also, you remember the Hage Stadium is not just coincidental. It's because he went there and he used to play. He was a versatile person in his youth because there's nothing that he did. He played soccer, he played rugby, he boxed a bit. He told me he boxed. I don't know whether he boxed actually. I don't know. So you see, perhaps had it not been for the person that this country gave birth to by the name Hage Geingob, chances are we would still be singing We Shall Overcome.
Mr. Kandetu, thank you so much for making time out to join us. Just finally, how do you honor that legacy, though?
By trying to emulate the good things he did, by trying to live to that legacy, by trying to make sure that we continue to sustain, to strengthen the Namibian house, by trying to think the way he thought, that nobody must feel left out or left behind. How do you do it? By making sure that when you talk to these people, from there, this person, from there you talk to this one must not feel that you gave this one better respectability. And that is when it goes to our cultural communities, to our societies, to our youth groups, to our different people in society. We must try to emulate this experience. Otherwise, we shall continue to beg the problem for a solution.
100%. Thank you so much for making time out to join us.
Thank you, sir.
There we have it, of course, former Director General here at the NBC as well. Before that, the first permanent secretary in the Ministry of Information and Communication, Bob Kandetu, reflecting on the late president and his role and influence on setting up the administration, as we know it, the state administration, but of course, the kind of legacy he leaves behind and how we need to honor him going forward.